How do you go about identifying waste? I mean, what is waste and how do you find it?
Right. So I'd say the probably the three main ways that I've used are the cloud native tools themselves. So there are a number of tools and recommendations within the cloud provider themselves. So I mainly work with AWS, so all the examples I'm going to give are AWS related. But there's a tool called Trusted Advisor, which goes through the account and looks for anything that it thinks may be waste or idle. So helps to identify things such as idle virtual machines, so EC2 instances, based on historic utilization profiles. So it looks at the CPU and network profiles of instances, and um, if the recent usage, so the last 2 weeks, is really low, it suggests that they may be idle instances. It also does that with other resources, so elastic IPs. So if you have any elastic IPs which aren't attached to an instance, you get charged for those. So Trusted Advisor helps point those out. Um, the second main source of information about waste, I'd say in my case, is a third-party tool. So we have a third-party tool plugged into our AWS billing and also into the native AWS monitoring tools, CloudWatch. And the tools assess the historic utilization against the resources that are available and makes recommendations on resources that you may be able to terminate. So some of them are overlap with the native tooling. So you get things such as EC2 and RDS instances, which look like they've got no active connections or no usage. So it could be candidates to remove. And you also get some right sizing recommendations. The third main source of information I use is the account team for our cloud provider. So we have enterprise support, and with that, we get an account team that's dedicated to looking after us. And we're running the monthly or quarterly business reviews. Some of the things that the TAM does is run some scripts against our accounts and provide some aggregated views, which look across a number of things, including spotting potential wasted resources or idle resources.
Can I ask, are you with a single service provider or are you a multi-cloud installation?
We have two main public clouds, but one of them is still quite small and just being used for corporate type technologies. But the bulk of our usage and spend is with one of those. So
It's
AWS.
interesting that you'll find that one of your ways of identifying waste is from the supplier themselves, uh, demonstrating their interest in giving their clients the best value service. Have they been particularly helpful?
Yeah, definitely. So I'd say in terms of the account team, they have a set of standard reports that they create for most customers, and then we were able to then work with the account team to then tune those to our specific needs. So we know there are certain areas that we need to focus in, or if we're aware of certain things that are unique to our use case, they're able to modify those scripts or create some new scripts to help generate that information. And then also in terms of tracking, so on a quarterly basis, whenever we have that meeting, they're presenting that information back to us. So, sort of like a scorecard saying, last
Right.
time we showed you this, and this is the change this time. So we can see whether we're actually, able to act on those recommendations or whether we've still got lots in the pipeline that we haven't done anything with.
Okay. So you identify areas where you think there may well be waste, idle instances, or whatever it is. Um, Clearly you don't want to be going to teams with things that aren't going to save a lot of money but are going to take quite a lot of effort to resolve. How do you identify those waste reduction opportunities that are going to be particularly valuable and require the least effort?
Yep. So in all three of those cases where we get the information from, they all give a suggested saving value. So key thing is dumping into Excel and then sorting. So getting the biggest ones first, or sometimes you're using pivot tables, aggregating. So there may be some accounts that are really bad at certain things. So although the individual, I'll give an example of load balancers, idle load balancers. So load balancers with no healthy backends. So we're still paying the hourly fee for those, but there's no traffic going through them, and there's no healthy VMs to receive the traffic from those. Due to the way that some of the accounts are using blue-green services, or if they're test environments, we have a lot of idle load balancers. So although each individual load balancer may only be, show up as $15 on each row, but when we aggregate by account, we see a big chunk on, certain accounts. So it's using those to try and work out, where the biggest potential savings are, and then targeting those first. Leave the smaller $1 or $2 a month saving till after you've dealt with the bigger ones.
It sounds like you have quite a well-structured account hierarchy, so you can identify which accounts offer the greatest potential for waste reduction. Is that something you've developed over a period of years, or is it something you're still working on? How does that work?
Yep. So we've got a number of different account structures just due to legacy and mergers, etc. But we are working to we're using some of the Amazon ADF framework, is called application deployment framework. So there, it sort of uses the best practices. So having a master account with nothing in it other than running AWS organizations, and then a set of accounts which are core accounts, which provide all your security and monitoring, tolling type things, and then different organization units within that to then group out the different divisions of the organization. So I'd say it's been a constant iteration. So there have been various versions of that sort of setup that we've been going through. And right now we're going through the latest iteration and adding some more automation and better governance and guardrails onto that account structure.
Just going back to the identifying waste reduction opportunities, and then filtering out the ones that are probably not worth the trouble and coming down to a list of those that look that the reward would be substantial relative to the effort involved. When you go to engineering teams with these recommendations, what sort of reception do you get? Do you get a positive, welcoming reception, or do you get a rather negative pushback, or is it mixed? What?
I'd say it's mixed. So depends on team to team. So also it depends when you approach a team what their workload is like. So some of the recommendations are quickly evaluated, and you may be given a good reason. So for instance, we've got some instances that are running a third-party service on them. So the support agreement dictates what types of instances you must run their service on. So even though we're not utilizing it to any real depth, we have to keep that size of instance. Mm-hmm. So that sort of recommendation gets quickly turned around and said, yeah, here's a good reason for it. Other recommendations may require some re-architecting. So some services that we have use a blue-green deployment. So we have all of the live traffic running on one branch, and then when we cut over the release, we cut over to the other branch. But we're not necessarily scaling down the branch where there's no live traffic on. So all of those instances are still up and running, which is waste. And the tools help identify that waste because they're just idle. They're running the CPU, nothing much else. It's commonly agreed that, yeah, that is waste and it'd be good to tune those down, but trying to fit that work into the backlogs just to get that re-engineering effort, the engineering effort to change the way it works sometimes takes ages.
Ages as in what? Weeks, months, what?
It could take months, just due to the priorities that the teams have. So particularly if some teams are very low on resources and they've got a big backlog, so they're having to evaluate every request that comes into that team. Some of them have a very strict high level timescales and high visibility, so obviously those will get prioritized. So it's just going back to the iron triangle of FinOps, and they're having to assess each case, and sometimes cost isn't the winner.
And what would be your normal point of contact with those teams for this sort of waste reduction initiative? Would it be at a fairly senior level, or down at maybe a guy running a team of half a dozen people? What's your normal contact routine?
It starts with the engineers in the team. So the people who really understand what the service is, just making sure that any recommendations or suggestions are actually valid ones that could be, either turned off or optimized. Because they're the people who really understand the resources that are running and have the in-depth knowledge about why certain things are using this amount of memory, or why at certain days you see no traffic on these resources. And then so usually it starts at that level, and yeah, using our ticketing system, so Jira, create a case with that team. If after some time some of these cases don't get any movement, so the ticket just stays in their backlog, then it's a case of going up through the the teams and the delivery managers, just to try and explain the reasons for this task and why I think it's urgent, so just so that it doesn't get missed.
Clearly, one of the challenges you have with changing account hierarchies and implementing tagging strategies is that generally requires teams to put effort into doing something where there isn't any obvious return to them. I mean, waste, you can point to the waste saved and say, look how much money we saved thanks to your efforts. But completing, doing more tags or doing more tagging or refactoring applications because you've moved them to a new account, that's effort without an obvious payback. How have you found the challenge of encouraging engineers down that path when maybe they're quite busy with other stuff?
Yeah, it is a really tough challenge to overcome. So one of the things that we're looking to move more and more towards is making it as easy as possible for the engineering teams. So having the tags applied within the CI/CD tooling. So one thing that we're working on at the moment is anytime somebody wants to provision some resources within an account, one of the steps as part of the CI/CD tooling is to refer the resources back to an entry in the CMDB that we have. By having that unique reference point, then we're able to enrich with further tags from the CMDB. So all they need to know is the high-level details, like what primary application is in CMDB, and then the rest of the information and the fields are grabbed directly out of CMDB, and then the tags are applied into the resources in AWS. So by doing it that way, the engineers don't have to think too much about it. As things change, so as reorgs happen and budget lines change, the CMDB is updated, and the next time that application is redeployed, it gets the updated relevant information. So it's trying to make it as seamless as possible for the engineers. We have tried in the past to do things such as set out some tagging policies and dictate what tags people should use. That ends up in the usual mess of things like the case of characters, camel case versus kebab case, being all different. Sometimes if you enforce that this tag has to be present, but you don't check that the value is a valid one, then all of your tags just go through with that key and a value, but it's not necessarily the values that are useful to you or the values that you need.
Do you find most of the challenges you face with FinOps initiatives come back to a cultural, behavioral thing in terms of people either being ready to respond or maybe not being ready to respond? How have you handled the cultural issues?
The cultural bits are the hardest thing. So some people just seem to understand it and are on board quite quickly. So they start to understand, for instance, going through the FinOps maturity, so the initial stage of visibility, just to see how much the resources that they're deploying actually cost. That does immediately change behaviors in some people. But I find it's all down to the individual. So again, some people are interested in these sort of things. Some people are not as interested or have other priorities or other things that they're that's taking a lot of their focus, so they don't have as much time to look at some of the FinOps aspects. Um, it, yeah, no hard and fast about what is the best way of approaching it. It all depends on the individual organizations. So we've tried various things. So some of the dashboards, the gamification, but they have some progress. But I haven't found the silver bullet that gets the culture across the whole of the technology org yet.
One of the things that seems to come out from many of the conversations I've had with other expert practitioners is you might call it, I suppose, to be crude, a carrot and stick approach. The carrot being a sort of friendly, personable, empathetic approach along the lines of the tooling seems to identify this particular opportunity. How does that sound to you? Does that sound right? Or maybe is there an error? Rather than here's something that's a waste reduction opportunity, fix it ASAP sort of thing. So the approach being a friendly, empathetic, let's work together on this rather than a dictatorial one. But at the same time, on the stick side, initiatives along the lines of, look, we're gonna turn this off in a few weeks' time unless you do something, right? So either act on it or lose it. Where do you stand on that? Is it horses for courses, or does your particular culture favor a particular approach?
We've had to use both. My preference is to use the carrot approach, where hey, look, using the tooling, these are the suggestions that are coming out from there. Let's try and look at these and see if they're valid and the recommendations can be acted on. That's a preferred approach, but occasionally when we are running very tight to budget, or if we're looking like we're going over budget, then it is very much a top down saying, hey guys, we need to really look at where we're spending, what we can turn off, what we can resize, where we can stop spend. So we've had to use both. So it all depends on what phase of the financial cycle we're in, or what the budget is looking like against the forecast.
That's great. And have you found now over time, let's say over the last 12 months to 18 months, have you found technical teams by and large beginning to embrace the FinOps vision, where instead of merely focused on the performance they're creating, they also take account of what it's going to cost the organization and have more of a value mindset? Have you seen that developing?
Yeah, again, it's in pockets of our organization. So there are some teams which do a really good job. So they've implemented a lot of automation on the stop-start on performance test environments. So stopping database instances and scaling in compute instances outside of working hours. So we see the impact of that in our overall spend. So if we chart our hourly spend over several weeks, you can see the definite peaks and troughs, and weekends where spend is much lower, mainly due to this automation, just based on some tags that we implemented. But there are other teams which are still coming onto cloud, so they're still learning how to really use it. And it's that change in mindset of whereas in the past they've had to create Jira tickets to other teams to get resources or servers deployed for them, weeks or months in advance. They're still sort of taking that approach into the cloud. So
Right.
resources are being created or things are being done for them weeks or months in advance of them being ready to use them. So we got different levels of maturity across the organization. So some more mature and understand the things, and still people coming up to speed all the time as well.
Bhups, that's really helpful. Thanks for talking to me this afternoon. It sounds like you're doing a great job there.
Thanks very much, Mike.